The wind howled like a restless spirit, weaving through the dense pine trees that surrounded Ethan Caldwell's remote cabin. Snow had been falling steadily for hours, covering the land in a thick, unbroken white. The cold was relentless, the kind that seeped into bones and stole the breath from your lungs. Ethan sat by the fireplace, the glow of the flames casting flickering shadows on the wooden walls. He sipped his lukewarm coffee, eyes heavy from exhaustion. Winters in the Alaskan wilderness were unforgiving, but he had learned to endure them. He had survived out here alone for years, long enough to forget the warmth of human companionship. Then, a sound shattered the silence. A faint scratching at the door. Ethan tensed. At first, he thought it was the wind playing tricks on him, but then it came again, soft, insistent. A whimpering noise followed, barely audible over the storm outside. He set his mug down, his heartbeat quickening. Stray dogs didn't last long in the wild. If something was out there, it was either desperate or dangerous. He reached for the rifle leaning against the wall, just in case, and approached the door cautiously. Taking a deep breath, he pulled it open. The sight before him sent a jolt of shock through his body. Two wolves stood on his porch, their fur matted with snow, their ribs pressing through their thinning coats. Their breaths came in ragged puffs misting in the icy air. The larger one, its coat a mix of black and silver, stood protectively in front of the smaller one, which limped slightly, favoring one of its front legs. Ethan's grip on the rifle tightened. Wolves were wild predators, not creatures that begged for shelter. He expected them to snarl, to bare their fangs, but instead, they only stared at him with piercing, desperate eyes. They weren't here to hunt. They were here to survive. The smaller wolf let out a soft whimper, shifting on its injured leg. The larger one lowered its head slightly, as if asking for help. Ethan's instincts screamed at him to close the door. Let nature take its course. It wasn't his problem. But another part of him, the part that knew what it was like to be alone, to fight against the elements with nothing but sheer will, hesitated. Seconds stretched into eternity as he stood there, caught between fear and compassion. Then, against every rational thought in his mind, he stepped back and opened the door wider. The larger wolf hesitated, eyes flicking between Ethan and the warm interior of the cabin. Then, slowly, it stepped forward. The smaller one followed, moving gingerly as it crossed the threshold. As soon as they were inside, a shudder passed through their bodies. The warmth of the cabin must have been a shock to their frozen limbs. They moved cautiously, their noses twitching as they took in their unfamiliar surroundings. Ethan closed the door behind them, sealing out the bitter cold. For the first time in years, he was no longer alone. The cabin, once a place of solitude, now felt smaller, its air thick with tension. Ethan remained by the door, watching the wolves with wary eyes. The larger one, strong despite its ragged state, had positioned itself protectively in front of the injured one, its golden gaze locked onto him. They made no move to attack, but there was no mistaking the raw wildness that radiated from them. He had just let two apex predators into his home. His grip tightened around the rifle slung over his shoulder. He should force them out. This was reckless, foolish even. They were animals, not pets. Wolves were unpredictable, driven by instinct, and hunger made even the most timid creatures dangerous. But then, the smaller wolf whimpered, a quiet, pitiful sound that echoed through the cabin. It tried to shift its weight, only to collapse onto the wooden floor with a soft thud. Its body trembled, its breath labored. The injury was worse than he'd thought. Ethan exhaled sharply. He had seen animals in this state before, starved, exhausted, barely clinging to life. He had once seen it in his own reflection, long ago, when he had first come to this place, broken and lost. The wilderness had nearly taken him, just as it was threatening to take them now. His gaze flickered to the fire. They wouldn't last the night outside. Cursing under his breath, He set the rifle aside and moved cautiously toward them. The larger wolf tensed but didn't growl. Its body was rigid, coiled like a spring, prepared to strike if he made the wrong move. Ethan stopped a few feet away, lowering himself onto one knee. Slowly, deliberately, he reached out his hand, palm up, a silent offering of trust. The smaller wolf, Luna he decided then to call her that, flinched but didn't retreat. She sniffed the air, wary, her ears flicking back. Her companion, the black and silver wolf, growled low in his throat, a warning. Ethan didn't move. Seconds stretched, the fire crackling in the silence. Then, ever so slightly, Luna inched forward. Not much, just enough to bridge the distance between them. Her muzzle hovered near his fingertips. Then she licked his hand. Ethan exhaled. The larger wolf, Ash because he needed names to ground them in something familiar, remained stiff but didn't interfere. Ethan pushed himself to his feet, his decision made. He moved to the corner where he kept the spare blanket, tossing it near the fire. They needed warmth. He rummaged through his supplies, pulling out some leftover venison from the smoked meat he'd prepared earlier. He set a small portion on the floor and backed away. Ash hesitated, then crept forward, his movements slow and deliberate. He sniffed the meat before tearing into it, his hunger momentarily overriding caution. Luna followed, though she ate with less vigor, her pain evident in every movement. Ethan leaned against the counter, arms crossed, watching them. He had just given shelter to wolves. There was no turning back now. The fire crackled softly, casting a warm glow against the log walls. The cabin, once filled only with the hum of the wind outside, now carried the sound of quiet breathing and the occasional scrape of claws against the wooden floor. Ethan sat at the edge of his worn-out armchair, his gaze never leaving the two wolves. Ash had finished his meal first, now curled beside Luna, his golden eyes half-lidded but watchful. Luna, still weak, lay with her head resting on her paws, her injured leg stretched out gingerly. Ethan knew better than to force his presence on them. Trust wasn't built overnight. Wild animals survived by caution, not kindness, and he wasn't foolish enough to believe a little food and warmth had changed that. But they hadn't attacked, and that was something. Ash still eyed him with suspicion, his body language coiled with tension, but there was no outright hostility, only uncertainty. He moved carefully, gathering supplies to tend to Luna's wound. Her leg was swollen, and though he wasn't a vet, he knew an infection when he saw one. He crouched near his first aid kit, pulling out a roll of bandages and a bottle of antiseptic. The moment he turned back, Ash let out a low growl, shifting in place but not lunging. A warning. Ethan froze, meeting the wolf's eyes. "I'm not going to hurt her," he murmured, his voice calm, deliberate. "She needs help." Ash didn't move, but the growl softened into a quiet rumble of discontent. Ethan took that as permission, or at least the closest thing he would get. Slowly, he moved toward Luna, keeping his posture non-threatening. She whined softly but didn't flinch when he reached for her leg. The wound was deep, likely from a snare or jagged ice. It had already started to fester. He worked carefully, cleaning the gash with a damp cloth before dabbing antiseptic over it. She flinched, a sharp whimper escaping her throat, but she didn't snap at him. Ash let out another warning growl, but it lacked the sharpness from before. Ethan worked quickly, wrapping the wound in fresh gauze. When he finished, he exhaled, sitting back on his heels. Luna licked at the bandages, her ears twitching, but otherwise didn't protest. For the first time since they had entered, Ash's posture relaxed only slightly, but enough for Ethan to notice. The shift wasn't much, but it was something. He was beginning to understand. Trust wasn't about words. It was about actions, about patience. They were testing him, just as he was testing them. And maybe, just maybe, they had started to believe he wasn't a threat. The next morning, Ethan woke to the sound of rustling. Ash was pacing near the door, his ears flicking toward the woods beyond the cabin. Luna was still resting, her injured legs stretched out, but her eyes were open, alert. Something had changed. The wolves sensed it before he did. He reached for his rifle, more out of habit than necessity, and moved to the window. Snow had stopped falling, leaving the world outside eerily silent. Then he saw it, a figure moving between the trees, bundled in thick winter gear, heading straight for his cabin. His grip tightened on the rifle as he stepped outside, boots crunching against the ice. The figure stopped a few yards away, raising gloved hands in a non-threatening gesture. A woman, her face partially obscured by a scarf and snow-dusted hood, studied him with sharp, assessing eyes. "You must be Ethan Caldwell," she said, voice steady despite the cold. "I'm Dr. Emily Hartman. I think you have something I've been looking for." Ethan didn't lower the rifle, but he didn't raise it either. "That so?" She nodded toward the cabin. Two wolves, a male and a female. They disappeared from their pack days ago. I've been tracking them through the storm. Ethan's jaw tightened. He didn't like people showing up unannounced, especially not out here, but something in her voice held no room for doubt. "And why exactly are you tracking wolves?" Emily took a slow step forward, careful not to startle him. "I work with a wildlife conservation group monitoring the packs in this region. These two were part of a study until we lost their signal in the storm. The female Luna, as we called her, was already injured when they vanished. We weren't sure they'd survive." Ethan exhaled sharply. "So they did have names." He glanced back at the cabin. Ash had moved closer to the window, his golden eyes locked onto Emily with a cautious intensity. Luna remained still, her breathing shallow but steady. "They found me," Ethan admitted, his voice gruff. "Showed up at my door half frozen. I didn't have much choice." Emily nodded, studying him with something close to curiosity. "You let them in?" He didn't answer immediately, but she must have seen it in his expression. "That's unusual," she murmured. He shrugged. Didn't feel right to leave them out there. Something in her softened, a flicker of respect in her gaze. "Then you might have saved their lives." She pulled off her gloves and unzipped her coat slightly, revealing a radio clipped to her belt. "I need to call my team. We have a facility where we can properly treat Luna's leg and make sure they're healthy enough to return to the wild." Ethan hesitated. He had expected her to try and take them by force, to treat them like specimens rather than living creatures. But she wasn't demanding. She was offering a choice. He glanced at the wolves again. Ash was still watching, his body tense, his instincts likely screaming at him that another human meant danger. But Ethan could see something else there too, hesitation. Like the wolf wasn't sure if this stranger was a threat or salvation. For the first time in years, Ethan felt the same way. Ethan stood at the threshold of his cabin, arms crossed, watching as Emily adjusted the frequency on her radio. Static crackled through the cold air before a faint voice responded on the other end. She exchanged quick words with her team, confirming the wolves' location and their condition. Meanwhile, inside the cabin, Ash hadn't taken his eyes off her. He wasn't growling, but his muscles were taut, his stance ready to defend if necessary. Ethan understood the feeling. Emily clipped the radio back onto her belt and turned to him. "My team can get here by tomorrow. The roads are still a mess from the storm, but they're clearing a path. We should be able to transport them safely." He gave a slow nod, but something gnawed at him. He glanced toward Ash, then to Luna, who had dozed off again, exhausted but breathing steadily. A memory stirred in the back of his mind tracks in the snow. Before the storm, he had seen something near the tree line. At the time, he had assumed they belonged to Ash and Luna, but now, "You said there were only two missing," he muttered. Emily tilted her head. As far as we know, yes. Ethan stepped past her, heading toward the edge of his property where the snow had been disturbed days before. The storm had erased most of the evidence, but a few faint impressions remained, half buried beneath fresh powder. He crouched, running his gloved fingers along the indentations. They were too large for a rabbit, too deep for a fox. Wolf tracks. But these were separate from the ones leading to his cabin. Emily followed, eyes narrowing as she examined the vague remains of the trail. "These aren't from Ash or Luna," she said, confirming his suspicion. "They're older. And look at the spacing, whoever left them was limping." Ethan exhaled. "So there's another one out there." Emily's expression hardened. "If it's injured, it won't last long in this cold." The wind picked up, carrying the distant rustle of branches. Ethan scanned the tree line, searching for movement, but the forest remained still. His instincts screamed at him something was watching. He had spent years alone in these woods, long enough to recognize when he wasn't the only one out here. Emily must have felt it too because she whispered, "Do you hear that?" A low, mournful howl drifted through the air. It was weak, almost fragile, but unmistakable. Ethan's chest tightened. Ash, still inside the cabin, suddenly let out a sharp bark, his ears perked, his body pressing toward the door. Luna stirred, whining softly. They knew. Somewhere out there, another wolf was waiting. And it was running out of time. The howl faded into the wind, but its echo lingered in Ethan's chest like a heartbeat out of sync. Ash was pacing near the door, his golden eyes flicking between Ethan and the tree line as if urging him to act. Luna, though weak, lifted her head, ears twitching toward the sound. Even in their battered state, they hadn't forgotten their own. Ethan turned to Emily. "If that wolf's alone and injured, we don't have until morning." She nodded, already zipping up her coat. "Agreed. But we need to be smart. If the storm picks up again, we could end up stranded ourselves." Ethan didn't need the warning. He had seen how quickly these blizzards could turn deadly, how the landscape could swallow even the most experienced tracker without a trace. But he also knew hesitation meant death for whatever was out there. "I'll go," he said, grabbing his gloves. "You stay with Luna." Emily shot him a sharp look. "Like hell you're going alone." Ethan hesitated, then relented with a sigh. "Fine. But we move fast." Outside, the cold bit at his skin the moment they stepped beyond the cabin's shelter. The wind had calmed for now, but the sky hung low, gray and heavy, promising more snow before the night was over. They followed the faint tracks Ethan had spotted earlier, moving cautiously as they wove between the trees. The further they went, the deeper the silence became, the kind of unnatural stillness that only came before a storm. Then, through the thinning veil of snow, a shape emerged. It was curled near the base of a fallen tree, barely visible against the ice-crusted bark. A wolf, its fur thick with frost, its body unnaturally still. Ethan's breath hitched. Emily was already moving. "We need to check if it's alive." They approached carefully, knowing a cornered animal could lash out, even in its last moments. Ethan crouched first, scanning for any sign of breath. Then, a shuddering exhale rose from the wolf's chest, faint but there. It wasn't dead yet. "I've got you," Ethan murmured, his voice barely audible over the wind. The wolf cracked open one amber eye, dull with exhaustion, its ribs stark beneath its fur. It tried to move, but its limbs barely responded. Emily knelt beside Ethan. "It's dehydrated, underfed. And that leg," she pointed at the way it was curled awkwardly beneath its body, likely twisted or broken. "We have to carry it back." Ethan had already stripped off his outer coat, laying it over the wolf as a makeshift wrap. "Help me lift." With careful movements, they hoisted the wolf between them. It let out a weak whimper, but didn't resist. The moment they turned back toward the cabin, the wind howled through the trees like an omen. and the first flakes of a new wave of snow began to fall. The storm had returned, and they were running out of time. Snow lashed against Ethan's face as he trudged forward, his boots sinking deep into the drifts. The weight of the unconscious wolf pressed against his arms, but he refused to slow down. Emily stayed close, shielding her radio from the wind as she fumbled to get a signal. The static crackled, stubbornly refusing to clear. "Come on," she muttered, adjusting the frequency. The storm was growing worse by the second, visibility dropping to near nothing. The cabin wasn't far, but every step felt like a battle against the elements. Then, finally, a voice cut through the static. "Emily? Do you copy?" Relief flashed across her face. "Mark, we found another wolf. It's in bad shape. We're bringing it back to the cabin now, but we need extraction as soon as possible." The radio crackled. "The roads are a mess. We're clearing a path, but we're hours out." Ethan clenched his jaw. "They didn't have hours." "We'll stabilize it," Emily responded, breathless from the cold. "Get here as fast as you can." A particularly vicious gust nearly knocked them off balance, forcing Ethan to tighten his hold on the wolf. It let out a weak whimper, barely conscious. Emily turned to him. "We need to move. Now." Ethan didn't argue. Against the raging storm, they pushed forward, each step fueled by sheer will. The cabin's outline emerged through the blinding snow, its golden light flickering like a beacon. They had made it, but the fight was far from over. The cabin was warm, but the air inside was thick with exhaustion and unspoken emotions. Ethan knelt beside the newest wolf, now resting on a makeshift bed near the fire, wrapped in blankets. The journey through the storm had drained it, but at least it was alive. Ash and Luna were close, their bodies pressed together, their golden eyes watching intently. They knew this wolf. That much was clear. Emily finished checking the injuries, her expression tense but hopeful. "Its pulse is weak, but it's stable. The worst thing right now is the cold. We just need to keep it warm and hydrated until help arrives." Ethan nodded, but his focus remained on the wolves. Ash had crept forward, his usual wariness replaced with something deeper, something instinctual. He pressed his nose against the injured wolf's fur, inhaling softly, as if confirming what he already knew. A low, keening whimper escaped him, a sound Ethan had never heard before. Luna, despite her injury, pushed herself forward as well. She licked the wolf's muzzle, nuzzling against it, and for the first time since they had arrived, Ethan saw a flicker of peace settle over them. "They know each other," he murmured. Emily nodded, watching the interaction carefully. "More than that. They're family." The weight of those words settled over him, twisting something in his chest. He had suspected as much, but seeing it, the way Ash had softened, the way Luna pressed so close made it real. These wolves had fought through the worst of winter, separated, wounded, and barely holding on, only to find each other again in the most unlikely of places. A distant rumble cut through the silence. Emily's radio crackled to life. "We're almost there." 10 minutes out. Ethan exhaled. He had known this was coming, but the reality of it struck harder than he expected. Soon, the wolves would leave. His cabin, which had for so long been a place of solitude, would be quiet again. Emily must have noticed the shift in his expression, because she placed a hand on his shoulder. "They'll be okay, Ethan. At the facility, we can treat their wounds properly, give them the best chance at survival." He nodded, but the ache remained. "And then what?" She smiled gently. "Then we release them back where they belong." Ethan glanced at the wolves, who were still huddled together, breathing as one. He had spent days fighting for their survival, offering them warmth and food, watching as trust slowly formed between them. Letting them go shouldn't have been this hard. But it was. A knock at the door signaled the arrival of the rescue team. Ethan stood, inhaling deeply before opening it. Mark and Sophia stepped inside, their winter gear dusted with snow, their faces tight with concern. "Storm gave us hell, but we made it," Mark said, surveying the cabin before his eyes landed on the wolves. His expression softened. "Damn, you really did it." Emily quickly filled them in while Sophia prepared the transport crates. The moment they were brought inside, the air shifted. Ash immediately tensed, stepping in front of Luna and the injured wolf, his body rigid. Ethan knelt beside him. "Easy," he murmured. "They're here to help." Ash didn't move. His muscles coiled, ready to fight. Emily crouched down, voice calm but firm. "We can't force this. They have to trust us." Minutes stretched into what felt like an eternity. Then, as if understanding, Ash let out a deep breath and stepped aside. One by one, they were guided into the crates. Luna hesitated the longest, pressing her forehead against Ash's before finally stepping in. Ethan clenched his fists. He had done what was right. So why did it feel like a part of him was leaving with them? As the truck pulled away, disappearing into the white expanse of the storm, Ethan stood in the silence of his cabin, the fire crackling behind him. The emptiness had returned. But this time, it didn't feel the same. Days passed, and the silence in the cabin felt heavier than before. The fire still crackled, the wind still howled through the trees, but the absence of quiet pause against the wooden floor left an emptiness Ethan hadn't expected. He told himself it was for the best. The wolves were where they belonged, safe, healing, preparing for the day they would return to the wild. Emily had kept her word. She sent updates when she could, pictures of Ash, Luna, and the third wolf, now named Shadow, resting together in an enclosure, growing stronger with each passing day. Luna's leg was healing. Shadow had regained some weight. Ash, ever the protector, stayed close to them both. Ethan should have felt relief. Instead, he found himself staring out at the tree line more often, listening for a sound he knew wouldn't come. Then, one evening, just as the sun dipped below the mountains, a familiar shape appeared at the edge of the clearing. A lone wolf stood in the distance, its black-silver coat shimmering under the fading light. Ash. He didn't come closer, didn't cross the invisible boundary between the wild and the human world. But he stood there, watching. A silent acknowledgement. A farewell. Ethan exhaled, a small smile ghosting his lips. Then, just as silently as he had come, Ash turned and disappeared into the trees. Ethan didn't follow. He didn't need to. Some things weren't meant to be kept. They were meant to be set free. And somehow that was enough.